had a paper come out fairly recently on Climate Refugia, or the refugia for vegetation. So I'm going to talk about that, but because this is CNPS and we're interested in conserving and restoring native plants, I also want to try to blend that with incorporating climate change into native plant conservation and restoration. So bear with me. I think I'm going to give a three-part talk. And so I'm going to first talk a little bit about some of the historical climate change that's been going on and the biotic response to it in California. And then talk a little bit about what are some different ways to think about climate change, and then get into how we might use map-based risk assessments and think about how we might try to build more climate resilience as we do our conservation and restoration. So some of these slides are a little out of date, but I think they still make the point. This is a chart of about 80 years of precipitation and nighttime low temperatures ending in 2016. You can see the blue line is annual precip. It bounces around. And we had that drought, that 4-year drought. And the unusual thing about the most recent drought prior to this year was that it was a hot drought. And that led to tremendous tree mortality and beetle outbreaks and fires in previous years. And here's just a little evidence from 3 weather stations located at Tahoe City at 6,000 feet, and Yosemite Valley at 4, and Placerville at 2,000 feet. And so I looked at these weather stations, and at Tahoe, 100 years ago, we have about a 100-year record, and 100 years ago, 9 months of the year were frozen, on average, were frozen across the whole night. And now we have 6 months, or as of about 2010, we had about 6 months were frozen. And we've lost October, May, and June. If we go down 2,000 feet to Yosemite, we start a 100-year record there with 6 months of the year are frozen on average at night, and now we have 3. We've lost the same number of months of frozen conditions. And if we go down to Placerville, we only have about a 70-year record there, but at the beginning of it, 3 months of the year are frozen across the whole month, and now they're not. So we might still get a snowstorm come in from time to time at Placerville, but that snow's not going to stick around, and so it won't give us the coffee drip of additional moisture that the snowpack provides and that California relies so heavily upon. So another way to think about that is, where's the banana belt? And the banana belt here is showing us where it used to be frozen during the winter months, and then by 2010, the yellow in this map is the area that is no longer frozen during those winter months, but the green is what is still frozen during those winter months. And so we can see that there's a loss of an important ecological factor, or perhaps a transition. And we can look into some biological data from this guy Albert Wieslander. He was kind of like the Yoda of vegetation, and back in the 30s he ran a vegetation mapping program. Every colored quad you see here is now digitized. It was surveyed, and we've digitized it over the years. And the old maps looked like this. This one was made in 1934. It's a 30-minute quad in the Sierras. And if you look at it closely, you can see a beautiful old topographic map with different species codes on there. So S for sugar pine, Y for ponderosa pine, D for Douglas fir, B black oak. The orange areas are chaparral. The areas with red vertical lines are early cereal because they had burned. And we worked hard to generate these into geographic information versions of maps, and we didn't have as cool hats as they had, and we didn't have as cool boots as they had back in the day, but we were able to do it. And so we've actually digitized, this is that same quad now rendered in this view to the CalVeg and WHR classifications for that are used today for much of our regulation and mapping purposes. Okay, well, here's the area of the Sierras that these guys went to. I have to say, they hiked up on the ridges and they sat on the ridges and they drew these patterns of vegetation onto maps from various viewpoints. So it's really quite amazing. It's an area approximately the size of Vermont and Connecticut. There's El Dorado County in there. And then here's a snapshot view of some of the changes. And we'll just talk about a couple of them. So on the left is the historic and the right is the about 2010 version of vegetation. And the blue that you see along the bottom, that's the blue oak woodlands, blue oak and blue oak pine woodlands. And we can see that they've become fragmented and there's a lot less, and that's probably the signal of land use. And then the mauve color, the purple color, is montane hardwoods and montane hardwood conifer. And see what it's done, what the purple has done with the pale green above it. So the pale green is a Ponderosa pine woodland, which we might remember being described as park-like by some of the first visitors, Europeans to California. And that pale green has lost in both directions. It's lost to the purple. The purple has expanded, hasn't necessarily moved upslope, but it has expanded a lot. And it's also lost to the dark green above it. The dark green is Sierra mixed conifer that's defined by the addition of the tree white fir, Abies concolor. And as we all know, white fir burns like a Roman candle. And when we had regular prescribed fires or Native American cultural fires, it was kept out of the canopy. But as it's come in both in the Sierras and throughout the West, it's made many forests more vulnerable to wildfire. And we can see the downslope movement of the Sierra mixed conifer over the last 80 years. Well, that's because even though it's warmed, it hasn't gotten unpleasant for white fir. White fir was just kept out by that constant disturbance. So we see a constriction of the Ponderosa pine, and that can also be seen a little bit more clearly in a map like this. So this shows the upslope retreat of coniferous forest on the Sierra Nevada's west flank. And it's about an average of 300 feet over 70 years. And those adult trees didn't die because of the nighttime warming that we've seen. We've seen about a 3.5 degree Fahrenheit warming during that time period of the nighttime lows. But if they were burned or cut, they might not come back. They might not reestablish. Well, so the Bay Area also got mapped back in the 30s. And I thought it might be fun just to look at that briefly. So, here's these beautiful old maps and the very detailed vegetation that they put in there. So there's Oakland, and there's a bunch of different chaparral types showing up in there and grasslands. And you can take that and look at a snapshot from, let's call it 1935, of urban and working landscapes that include agriculture and ranching in blue and green here, okay? And then here's what it looked like by 2010. So the brown is the additional urban that has grown in this area. And the first time I made a map like this, I was like, whoa, there must be something wrong here. That can't be right. But yes, that is, that's the footprint of urban expansion over the time that we've, of that time period in the Bay Area. And one of the things we've done in my lab is to build some urban growth models under different policy scenarios. And so here's one view of what future urban growth, where it might go. And if we were working on conservation in this area, we might start to pick out places like this where we see, and I'm sure you guys know already, that there's connectivity of mountaintops and parks, and perhaps that's not a great place to build houses, and so perhaps it could be protected. Some other evidence that came from the Wieslander data is a paper that Patrick McIntyre published back in 2015. And he looked at these different ecoregions. So just mostly look at the colored chart there. The green shows the proportion or the basal area of pines pine species in the North Coast, the Sierra foothills, the Sierra Highlands, the South and Central Coast, and the Peninsular Ranges in the two time periods. And what you can see there, and this is based off of vegetation plots that the VTM people put in, the Wieslander people put in against modern forest inventory and analysis plots. And so you can see that there's a decrease. The dark green lines are always lower than the bright green lines, and that is a decrease in the number of conifers, or the proportion of conifers. And there is an increase in the dark brown in most of the regions, and that indicates an increase in the oak species in those areas. So over the 70 years of this time period, we see some differences there. Another monitoring project, a little more current, it shows, I think it's 13 or 14 years of monitoring birds at all of these locations in Northern California. And what Brett Furness, who's a biologist with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, found is that the average trend in species richness, where you found them over that time, increased over those years. And so that now we're finding the neotropical migrants have really moved up from about 1,000 feet, and they're up to about 1,000 meters, up to about 1,500 meters. So some highly mobile species are responding to changing climates already. And then, of course, we have stochastic events like the progressive canopy water stress that was in the 2016, the drought, and that led to the loss of about 8% of all of the trees in California in mortality, predominantly in the Southern Sierra, and predominantly in secondary effects from beetle outbreaks, but also some direct physiological drought stress in some locations. Well, what about the future? Climate change models. So I thought I'd spend just a few minutes going back over to make sure that we're all on the same page as to where do these GCMs, these global climate models, come from, and how might I select one if I was going to be thinking about doing some work that incorporated climate change considerations. Well, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, is a group of about 2,000 who review the evidence and set emission standards and essentially assess the impacts and make some projections into the future. And they do this on a cyclical basis. And we're currently in the 5th edition of it, with the 6th edition coming out even as we speak. And when they come out with a report, it goes for 5 or 6 years, and people use that information. And among the groups that wait eagerly for those reports are the global climate modeling groups. What's a global climate modeling group? It's 100 nerds with a supercomputer, and each one has their own assumptions about how circulation patterns on Earth will impact climate conditions and weather conditions in different places. So they take the new emission scenarios that come out and plug them into their 3D models and crank out future projections on what the climates might be. And there's MyROC in Japan, and they're very good at simulating the Western Pacific. And there's the Hadley Center, I believe, in England, and NCAR over in Boulder, Colorado, and they each have their own assumptions, and they run out their models. And those GCM outputs are three-dimensional models that are usually at least 100 kilometers on a side. So, and often even coarser than that, up to 250. And so at that scale, geographic factors like the Sierra Nevada almost disappear. And so for resource managers, we need 2 additional steps before we can actually take what has been produced by the GCM modeling groups and use it for, in any suitable way for our regional planning or risk assessments. We need bias correction and downscaling. So bias correction is essentially this. The GCMs are good at giving you the red and the brown lines. It's the future time, and it's saying, here's what the trend is going to be. It's going to, it's going to be worse, or it's going to be not quite as bad. But the historic trend in the black line is not something that they typically are connecting to, particularly when you're talking about a specific area. And so bias correction is when you do this. You say, okay, we're going to keep the same rate of warming or rate of change as they have documented in the particular GCM, but we're going to start it from the current conditions, or we're going to start it from a baseline of current conditions, perhaps a 30-year mean at our location. And so when you're looking at future projections, one of the questions to ask is, have these models been bias corrected for the Bay Area? Now, just a few weeks ago, there was a publication in the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences by Schwalm et al., and they basically came out and said, look, the worst case emission scenario in our current version, which is the RCP 8.5. There's RCP 2.6, 4.5, 6, and 8.5, and that's referring to watts per meter squared. That's the track that we're currently on. So for most resource managers that I talk to after they consider that, they're like, well, even if we manage to change our emissions and reduce them, that's a long-term goal. And in terms of risk and assessments for what I might do in the next 10 years, I should just use the 8.5. So the little chart up here on the upper right is essentially mapping out the global climate models from a bunch of different models for California. And the X on the X-axis, the intersection, that's the average of California's precipitation and nighttime lows for 1980 to 2010. And all the little dots off there going off to the right show warming. Each one is a different GCM. And so they all show warming into the future by the end of century. And some of them are wetter, those are the ones below the line, and some of them are drier. Those are, wetter is above the line and drier is below the line. More of them are below than above. And so what we've done for many of our impact assessments is to look at a range. And we picked the green and the red ones, so which are approximately 25% more or less annual precipitation than we get today. That black dot in the middle is if you took an average, but the average doesn't really give you very much information about how things might change if we have less precipitation or more. But you can bracket that. So bracketing it rather than taking the average lets you look at the range of possible futures for an area. And so we start with that, and the GCMs typically give you T max, T min, and precipitation. And then we run it through a climatic hydrological model called the Basin Characterization model. And what this does is it says, look, we've got downscaled data. We're looking at it at 270 meter grid scale. And we also have soil maps that are digital and geological maps that are digital. So let's use those and try and balance the water budget. And we balance the water budget by saying, okay, that there's a picture of a cross section of the soil, and you have the geological part down below, which could be fractured or could be permeable, and it could allow water to go into it. And then you have a certain amount of soil depth, and that soil depth can be filled up with precipitation, or it can get emptied. And if it fills up beyond the soil moisture holding capacity, any excess becomes either runoff or recharge down there at the bottom. So we input precip and air temperature up at the top, and then there's a snowpack module, where not quite as relevant for the Bay Area, although I love to see it when Mount Tam gets dusting. And there's runoff and recharge, and then there's the use of moisture in the soil by plants, and that's the energy balance on the right-hand side. And that can be calculated by starting with the estimate of solar radiation, the spatial estimate, plus air temperature. And those two give you plant evaporative demand or potential evapotranspiration. How much would a plant like to go if it could just go nonstop? But that's limited by how much water is actually in the soil. And so if if the plant would like to go for twice as much as is in the soil, it can't. It can only go for as much as the soil will permit, as we've filled the soil with precipitation on a monthly basis. And any deficit, any extra that is an evaporative demand that's not met, that's a measure of plant water stress called climatic water deficit. And so climatic water deficit is a variable that many plant ecologists are interested in because it turns out to be a nice way to integrate air temperature and precipitation and start to incorporate site level factors when you're looking at things. So what does this kind of stuff do? Well, okay, for nighttime low temperatures, average nighttime low temperatures, there's California on the far left, the little one, and then across the top row, there's the warm and wet and the hot and dry futures. And those three maps look fairly similar. But then when you look at the bottom row, what those are showing you is the amount of change in every location. And so sometimes it's better to look at how much the expected change is rather than, how much blue do I have and how does that change with regards to temperature. We have it also for precipitation. So we can see here the current on the left, and then the wetter future is in the middle, and the drier future is on the right, and they all look fairly similar. You can see some pattern differences, but then when you look at the change maps down below, you can really see how that pops out with a lot less moisture in the lower right on the MyRock model. And snowpack, well, so snowpack and also climatic water deficit, snowpack declines, and it doesn't matter if it gets wetter or drier, because even if it gets wetter, that is not coming as snow, as we all know, it's coming as rain. And climatic water deficit, I'm sorry I don't have that slide in here, but it also does the same thing. Even if we get wetter, the rate of warming is going to increase evaporative demand more than the increase in precip that is predicted. But it's more than likely, at least in my opinion, that it looks like we're moving towards drier conditions, or at least choppier, very sporadic rainfall. And if we get more intense and constricted rains, then those don't necessarily get absorbed in that soil moisture holding capacity. But building soil moisture holding capacity is very important, right? So if we can't hold it, then it turns into runoff or recharge, and that is, that's water that's lost effectively from ecosystem process or ecological processes at the site level. Okay, so that's my very brief review of climate models. And then I wanted to talk just a little bit about different ways to think about and project climate change. So we can ask where things will shift to and where will current conditions persist. And there's a lot of terms that get thrown around. And so I wanted to just kind of get on the same page with what those might mean. Climate velocity is the distance and speed that a set of climate conditions move under projected futures. Range shifts are like the biological analog. It's the distance that a species' range might shift, remain within a set of climatic conditions. So velocity is really physically based, and range shifts are going to be the biological response to that, one measure of it anyway. If species can keep up, they may be able to track the velocity of climate change. Place-based is the level of change at a specific location, and climate refugia are locations that retain tolerable conditions for a set of species. So there's a bunch of different tools out there. So this one is just to illustrate what climate velocity might do. So here off this website that you can find of climate change in some 400 cities in North America, I picked Reading, and it shows that the arriving climate is going to be similar to what's found in San Isabel, Mexico. And the climate that's in Reading is likely to move north to, looks like Ashland. So there's your arriving and departing climate and an illustration of climate velocity. For range shifts, here's a map for Ponderosa Pine. And the way these are typically done is with species distribution models, and you start with a bunch of known locations, which would be the dots on the far left for Ponderosa, and you correlate those with climate conditions. And then you say, well, where do the best correlated climate conditions shift to? And you can build these kind of estimated range models. So here we have the hot and dry on the left and the warm and wet on the right. And the green areas are suitable today and remain suitable under this particular projection. The red areas are areas that would be lost under each projection, and the blue areas are areas that become climatically suitable. It doesn't mean that this species would be able to occupy those other areas. It just says that the climate becomes more suitable for it, and that might be a possibility for it to occupy those locations. But competition, dispersal, establishment, all of those other questions still remain when we look at these. So here's another example for Douglas fir. So Douglas fir, we've got the current in green, and then the range lost in red, and under a hot and dry, we can see a lot of loss around the Bay Area and increasing in the north end. And of course, Douglas fir extends into Oregon, so it would be better to include a range model across its whole range to try to capture that. Another way of looking at things is to say, hey, we have a network of protected areas. And a colleague of mine recently published a paper on the wildlife refuges in California, Nevada, and Southern Oregon. And what we did is we said, for each refuge, these refuges are all isolated from each other, and so there's not a lot of chance that species will move, but where will the climate from any given refuge move within the network? So if I'm a biologist and I want to try to retain 15 species that currently occur within the wildlife refuges, then I might think about where my climate analogs are going to be. And we identified 5 different types of climate analog movement. So on the top you have disappearing, so the circle with green, the climate does move somewhere, but it doesn't move into any of the other protected areas that I'm considering. A single analogous climate is, you can see there's a little bubble in green, and that climate moves to a different bubble, but only to one. Multiple analogous climates, and the third one down, show where there's, excuse me, show where there's maybe the climate from one is found in multiple other ones that might be climatically suitable for species. Enduring climates are locations where the refuge, in this case, retains the same kind of climate that it has now. And climate hubs are locations that receive climates from multiple other protected areas, and they kind of become like a train station. So, and potentially climate hubs and multiple analogous climates, those places may be the same too. So they could be coming and going. So that's another way of considering it as sort of a network. If you have a series of places that you're looking at and you're thinking about what do I do among the places that I'm working in. Then this is a report that has been adopted by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife that we put out a number of years ago. I think in 2017 it came out, or 2016, and we've been building on it since then. And they asked us to basically go in and look at the vulnerability assessment for California's terrestrial vegetation. And so we started with the 2015 statewide map, and we've done this both for macro vegetation types and for WHR types, wildlife habitat relationship types. And we're going to integrate that with different climate projections. So here is pine and oak woodland areas across California that was pulled out of that veg map. And now it's colorized by how frequently are different climates occupied in the 1980 to 2010 time slice. And so the areas that are in blue in the map are areas that you go there and it's like the condition is similar to 80% of the other places that you might go that this vegetation type is found. But the red areas, only 1 out of every 100 locations has that it occupies has that climate, and the orange is only 1 out of every, only 5 out of every 100. So we basically made an assumption under the current time to say, look, if a type is in a climate very frequently, it's probably not stressed by that climate. It's probably suitable for that climate. But if a type only is there very rarely, we expect that part, which is out on the wings of the distribution, to be stressed already. And we're going to use that, we're going to use the values that we get for this type, the climate condition values, and we're going to see what happens to every location. So instead of saying, where will something move to, we say, how is it going to change where we are? And this was, we developed this in response to resource managers saying, look, I don't care if Coast Redwoods move to Vancouver Island. I would like to move to Vancouver Island, but I can't. I work here. Give me something that lets me see some variation on the landscape that I'm working on. And so that's how we came up with this place-based risk assessment. So here's an example from Blue Oak Woodlands. And the Blue Oak Woodlands are showing us in current time, and then by the end of century under the warm and wet and the hot and dry. And all the red locations are locations that those stands are moving into conditions that today only 1% of the stands encounter. And the black ones are climate conditions that we don't have anywhere in California today. Well, you do it for one type, you do it for all of them, you stitch them together, and you get this Rorschach view of current time climate suitability for what's there. And then you can move to looking at future conditions and say, where do we have higher risk? And we see that there's some places that remain in blue. So the right-hand column here is the 8.5 warm and wet and hot and dry, and that's end of century. So that tells us that there are some places that are climate refugia, and we might want to be thinking about doing restoration or conservation in those locations. Okay, I see that I'm taking more time, but I hope everybody's bearing with me. Okay. So what you see is a map where we took those areas that were in blue from both the warmer and the wetter, the warmer and wetter and the hotter and drier, and we combined them. And we said, okay, for managers, they need the most confidence that they can get for where do we have places that are going to remain suitable. And so if you combine, you intersect the hot and dry with the warm and wet, which is the green, those are the places that are predicted to remain suitable for what's there until the end of century, plus or minus 25% precipitation and warming between 2 and 4 degrees centigrade. So that's what, and then the red and the blue are additional locations. The red is additional locations that remain suitable if it's a hot and dry future, and the blue are additional locations that remain suitable under a warm and wet future. So the way that Cal Fish and Wildlife has adopted that, there's over 500 vertebrate species, and they have a range map, and they know what habitats each vertebrate uses. So here the California towhee, the map of the California towhee on the right, on the left, sorry, shows its range, and then the colored areas are the vegetation types that it uses inside of that. And then the center column are our end century climate risk projections, and the blue areas are the most suitably remaining. And then we intersect that center column together, and we come out with the map on the right-hand side that says, for the California towhee, the green areas are the places that if you did habitat preservation, that might be some of the best places to keep them in situ at those locations. I'm going to move a little faster. So here you see, this one is from the campfire, but we have lots of examples of where we need to do restoration or where we have recovery occurring. And those often can be places that will see vegetation transitions, because like you saw with the VTM map and the retraction of conifers in the Sierra, it takes a big disturbance sometimes, and then the establishment conditions have changed from what was there before. And so then you might see something else coming in, or vegetation type conversion. This is the Feather River. Here's the campfire with the vegetation map of the campfire prior to its burn. Here's what the future climate projections in the column on the right-hand side suggest, that by the end of century, much of the campfire area will be highly stressful for what had been there before. So what does that suggest? To me, it suggests that rather than straight up conifer forests in many places, you might want to be hedging your bets by trying to get more of a hardwood conifer mix in there as one strategy for anticipating the changing conditions when you replant. This is another example from now so long ago. What was this? The rim fire. And the green areas are end-century refugia. The red areas are areas that if you replanted what had been there, we expect, which is mostly Ponderosa Pine, we'd expect it to be stressed within 30 years. And then the nice thing about this is it's spatially explicit. So, and now in this image, you see fire severity and areas that are expected to remain suitable and unsuitable. And if people are doing planting in there, even if, as usual, they don't pay too much attention to my predictions, we have a guess. And you know, if the ponderosa that are in the red area get planted in the red area all die, that ratchets forwards our information. But if they do fine, we also go, oh, well, maybe a 5%, the last 5% was not, you know, these trees are more resilient than that, and it's only the last 1% or 0.5% of the climate frequency distribution that's the tipping point. And so then we can do this. Here's the west side of Yosemite National Park. But let's shift gears a little bit. I wanted to bring this paper to your attention by Susan Harrison and Reed Noss, and they're talking about how you might think about where future endemic diversity might be. And so you have past climatic stability and future. You have low change velocity or high or low future, low past extinction, low future extinction rates. So this kind of flow chart perhaps is of interest to people that are thinking about how do I preserve endemic plants. And I've stolen a few slides from the Vtm project. So probably if there's anybody on that project online, thank you. Because I had to have at least one nice picture in here, or two. And so I'm zipping here, but some considerations for conservation and restoration work then are, well, where are the climate refugia on my landscape? How can I anticipate future planting, anticipate future climates, and therefore select species or even genotypes for an area? What's the sensitivity and adaptive capacity of my species? What are the landscape dynamics? Is assisted migration needed? If it's a large fire, what kind of patches do we have, and what kind of patch recovery using natural dispersal processes could we try to promote? And recognizing that in some of these large fires, it's also for insects. And so, you know, both for insects and for plants, then also the phenology, the timing of things becomes important. And it emerges that seed collection and triage collections of seeds from areas that are at high levels of risk, become very important. So given the recent fires, I would say one of the things that we really want to be trying to do is collect seeds from native populations of areas that haven't burned, because we don't know if they're going to burn in the future. And then the metapopulation dynamics is kind of similar to the wildlife refuges that I mentioned. I'm going to skip over adaptive capacity and sensitivity, other than to say that you can score them yourselves. In the report that I had scored for 7 characteristics, and a fundamental difference can be a fire-sensitive plant has has a flammable architecture or thin bark, whereas a fire-resistant plant in the sensitivity column would have thick bark or non-flammable architecture. But if fire as an adaptive trait would be something like stump sprouting or seed germination after smoke. And so you can think about what the life characteristics of the plants you're working on are, and break them into sensitivity and adaptive traits, and then think about how those might be important. And particularly for things like serpentine endemics, those may be very important because serpentine plants don't move around much. They've seen a much broader range of climate conditions over the past, and perhaps they're better adapted than and less at risk than they might seem just from a limited distribution. I don't know that, but it's an example. And I like to think about, this classification might be helpful for you, where the classification of your map, is it at the species level or the community and stands or habitats or physiognomic? And then what ecological processes kind of cross-reference to those? So at species, it's reproduction, dispersal, establishment. And then by the time you're getting to community, it's competition, invasion, and disturbance. And by the time you get up to habitats, there's local environment and regional environment. And then, what might be the responses that you are seeking at the species level at a location? Presence or absence and the disappearance of a species is similar to a range shift if you're looking at a whole map, right? Because the species was there, and maybe it just winked out for a while, it's going to come back, it's a metapopulation thing, or maybe it's winked out and it's no longer suitable in that area. So this framework, which I guess is going to be part of the materials you get, might be helpful if you're considering restoration projects or assisted migration, and just recognizing that there's all these different scales that are out there. One last thing I'll talk about is a project I'm doing with Jessica Wright from the Forest Service. She's a Forest Service geneticist, and Joe Stewart is the postdoc on that. Ryan Boynton, who is also listed, is a GIS programmer with me. These are locations, assisted migration has actually been going on in forestry for the last 70 years in California. And the state's broken into these seed zones, as you see here, and each one encompasses about 100 miles, and there are these blobs on a map, and seeds that have been collected that are in our cold storage for conifer regeneration and production, and there's a reforestation center that's being reactivated by CAL FIRE here in Davis to try to help areas on private lands that have burned, and there are other nurseries that are specific to Forest Service lands, including one in Placerville. They catalog the seeds that are collected by the guys that climb up on those trees and get them into these seed zones. And so then we can think about how the climate might change in the seed zones. And here's November nighttime lows, and there's a historical trend across the top, and there's the drought 2012 to 2015 drought years, and then there's a projected future, and you can see there's quite a bit of change in the nighttime lows in the Sierras in November. Or we could look at precipitation, and the August maximum temperature, similarly getting a lot hotter by end of century. We could look at precip, and precip is highly dependent on the GCM that you use because they're either wetter or drier. This one's a drier. And so that leads to the question of, if I was trying to replant something in this little blue area over here in the San Francisco Bay, and if it was a conifer forest, I have three tools that I can really play with as I'm looking at anticipating future climate. And those are, the first is, what's the species mix? Am I going to plant what was there before, or I'm going to bring in some other stuff and hedge my bets? The second is the density, and for forestry, typical density objectives are quite high. And then the third is, what's the genetic source of the material that of the seeds that I'm planting? And so in this, and you might want seeds that are coming from what is today currently hotter and drier, in anticipation that the place that you're planting into is going to become hotter and drier. And so it kind of flips our traditional genetics on its head, which is typically we want to preserve the local genotype, But if there are other populations that have a genotype that has been grown up in a place that is already hotter and drier, then perhaps that makes sense to bring in. And in forestry, that's certainly now being considered of how we move that around. And so on our seed zone project, we have a draft map. I'll send an email out once it's finalized, hopefully by the end of the year, where you can go in and you can pick a location. And I picked this location on the Bay Area, and the blue area is where a theoretical replanting might be occurring. And the green is, in this case, it's where by 2040, where are the conditions today that by 2040 would be in my blue area? And so there's a version of an anticipatory that could tell you where to go look for seed if you've got a 40-year window. If you have a 70-year window, then it starts to look a little more grim, although there's a lot of detail I'm going to skip over with regards to whether you're just looking at temperature or you're looking at mean annual precipitation, and this little slider up here lets you play with how adaptive the plant might be. And so right now it's got a relatively low tolerance, but if it has a higher tolerance, then you're going to get more areas suitable. And then by end century, here's that same blue area, and on a hot and dry future, the climate that has that today is down by Bakersfield. In a warm and wet future, most of the Central Valley has it. So you can see that there's quite a bit of differentiation there. But it helps us to think about in terms of where's the climate that's coming to the site that I'm planting, and what's the life cycle of the species that I'm planting. Will it have time? Will the species have time to adapt? Should I possibly be thinking of genetic seed source from another location? And I don't think I have enough time to do a live demo of the site. The site gives us a few other things. So I'm just going to finish then by recapping on some of the different approaches that we could bring to bear in our conservation planning and restoration efforts, including considering where are the climate refugia, anticipatory site plantings, rather than solely trying to reestablish exactly what was there, the sensitivity and adaptive capacity of your species, the landscape dynamics. Are we talking about a large fire patch recovery strategy? Are we looking at assisted migration? The phenology, so what's the life cycle of the species? Seed collections and triage collections, so going out and going after remaining populations of plants after large fires to try to have something to actually do restoration with. Metapopulation dynamics. I'm sure there's many more, and I'm sure that you are ready for me to stop blabbing on. So thank you, and we'll take any questions.
Hey, thanks so much, Jim. There's quite a few good questions in the Q&A. Did you want to just take a look in there?
Yeah, sure.
Maybe start from the bottom and go up, or however you want to.
Whatever you say. How to manage insects and ecosystems that depend on local plants for their life cycles when those plants no longer thrive in their historic locations. Well, Art Shapiro is a UC Davis professor and probably the best naturalist at UC Davis and one of the best in the entire system. He spent close to 50 years studying butterflies, and he wanders around a lot. And his comment with regards to the recent fires are, it depends on two things. It depends on how many patches remain, so whether the insects were able to persist in some fire or disturbance refugia, and also it depends on the life cycle stage of the insect when a disturbance occurred. So if it was in a dispersal mode, then it has a better chance to persist through the disturbance at that location. Otherwise, it may take a long time, and we know that there's the reestablishment of species takes a long time in some of these burned areas. So I don't know that there's a single good answer for that, but that would be at least some context. You can consider urban landscapes at all in your research. Cities may be a place to preserve biodiversity. I agree that fire is more controllable, and we've actually started to run a project where we model the connections of open space. We published a paper about that for Seoul, a city of 600 square kilometers in South Korea this year. But I would say that that is the wheelhouse of the folks on this line, or many of them, and I encourage you to consider that. So backyard conservation, absolutely. Anyone working on a planting guide that takes these things into consideration, sort of like seed propagation book, there's probably quite a few. I'm sure there are quite a few. In Davis, there's a scientist, a colleague who's come up with a plant palette, and I think the city of San Francisco has this kind of thing, although I don't know that they've started to apply a climate change lens to those planting guides. So really, I think the only thing that is different here is that there's climate lenses that we can bring to the same set of questions and challenges and the same tools that we use as before. And so I encourage you to not change your entire approach, but yes, I think that would be a useful thing. Yes, the PNAS paper does say that the basal area of oaks has expanded between 1930 and the present day. And there's a weak correlation with the change in climate. And so that's a 2015 publication in the Proceedings of National Academy of Science, and you can find it there. Where can we find these projected range maps of animals like the bird range map you showed? So the range map is, I don't know if it's on the BIOS website, but it's a California Department of Fish and Wildlife, that's their system, and it's called the California Wildlife Habitat Relationship Model. If you Google that, you'll find both a description of the habitats. Every vertebrate has been connected to the habitats that it uses and ranked, and that was an expert-based thing, so that it's got a fair amount of noise in it, but it's still what is used for much of the planning and regulatory functions that CDFW provides. So I would point you to their website. What was the range map before? Was the range map before Douglas for Ponderosa Pine? Yes, it was. I'm sorry, it says PIPO at the bottom. So when you get the slides, it'll say PIPO down there at the bottom. What's the URL for the climate change tool that shows the effects in different locations? So I think that's probably the one that I just was projecting. I'm not sure which one you refer to. The climate exposure, the place-based materials are not on any particular web-based tool. Unfortunately, they are just data, but the Cal Fish and Wildlife is using them, and you can download the data from the Climate Commons, and I think maybe also from the Cal Fish and Wildlife. The other climate tool, I'll send an email to Eddie when it's public, and we'll put it out hopefully by the end of this year. Is it possible for us to see historic Bay Area maps somewhere online? The maps are, there's a Wieslander vegetation type mapping project, the VTM Maps, through the lab of Maggie Kelly, Professor Maggie Kelly at UC Berkeley. A lot of the old photos are there, and the 16,000 vegetation plots that they surveyed around the state over the decade are there. They have the maps, but I don't know if those are actually up and visible online. So yeah, it took me an awful long time just to get them digitized. I had to nickel and dime my way through every national forest and park, and try to find the funding to digitize them. And I would love to have them online somewhere, but we don't have the capacity to do that from where I am. Isn't the retreat of Ponderosa Pine due to fire suppression? The downslope loss of Ponderosa Pine woodlands on the west slope of the Sierra was due to fire suppression, because white fir was able to come into that. And it's a very, contradictory to everything we think about climate change, things moving up and moving north or moving to high latitudes. And yet we see the effect of land management that not only in California, but across the West, has made many of our conifer forests more susceptible to fire because of Smokey the Bear and 70 years of fire suppression, mostly since the end of World War II, when we had a lot of people who could fly bombers and were really good at putting out fires. So I would say, even though it warmed, it didn't bother the physiology of the white fir, and the white fir was able to advance downslope. So Ponderosa Pine woodlands, Ponderosa pines are still found across their range, but they are now in a different vegetation type that includes this flammable tree on the west slope of the Sierra in their upper end of their pure range. And at the lower end, the proportion of oaks to pines has moved in the direction of more oaks and fewer pines. And I expect that under any of these big fires, areas that are at the low end of the conifer range in the Sierras will see quite a bit of conversion to more broadleaf and fire adapted systems. So I think that was the first one. Maybe there's a few more that came in.
Yes, there's about 6 or 7 down at the bottom. Sorry, I probably should have asked you to start at the top.
Oh, hey, Kelly Torres. I recognize your name. It's nice to see your name there. Let's see, Daniel Guzman also, I recognize. Are there any mapping scenarios also integrate data on any invasive species? Sure, invasive species are something that I wasn't able to pull in. You know, a lot of times an integrated model that brings in a lot of different components, it has more assumptions in it, and it can, you know, there's advantages and disadvantages to using this. So I don't know of any that have invasive specifically in it, but CalIPIC is the group that is, you know, invasive, what is that, the Invasive Species Council? They are working on invasives, so you might check over there. Anticipatory site planning. Are you saying we should be open to changing plant communities based on their tolerances, similar to Peter Moyle's reconciliation conservation? You know, this is really painful, but I would say that we need to think about conservation. Like, it used to be that conservation was, hey, let's go, you know, here's a really important place. It's got high biodiversity. Let's, you know, have a campaign, raise the money, buy it. Now it's protected and we're good, right? You know, and now we have to manage the landscape. We have to be humans back in this landscape, watching it and seeing what happens. And in some cases, you know, most of the resource managers that I talk to who are in national forest or parks or state parks, their big money decision, they're stretched so thin, it's, you know, you can practically see through them. But their big money decision is, am I going to try to retain what's here, or is this avalanche of climate change too much and I should go with it and kind of, you know, try to ease the transition to something else? And I've got limited money and I'm going to do one or the other. I can't do both, really. It's very difficult to do both. So I would say that it's going to come down almost to a case-by-case basis. You know, there's some places that it's like, wow, no, you know, the giant sequoias are here and we got to keep them here. And then there's other things that's like, well, you know, should we have some experiments? But I would say everything we do, whether we do reconciliation, conservation, and we try to mix things, or we stay the same, or we don't do anything, every one of those things is an experiment. And so I would encourage you to document it, document what was done or not done, and then also write down what you think is going to happen. Because 5-10 years from now, we can start to use those kinds of things. You don't just try to react, like look at it and say, I think this is going to happen, and we're going to do this. And that's recorded somewhere, written down somewhere, so that 5 years from now, we can evaluate that and get a better understanding of how sites are mediating or interacting with climate change, how species at those sites are doing, and that's going to give us a much better idea of how to handle the land management in the future. But I would say that almost every square location is, you know, we got to think about it as the climate is changing, and we're going to see a lot of dynamics, and so we have to anticipate that. Who's using this research? Shouldn't those people thinking about rebuilding in areas where there are fires look at this type of data? Well, certainly, I would point you therefore to the California's 4th Climate Vulnerability Assessment, which is online. And there are quite a few papers that, and quite a few guidelines with regards to, housing in the WUI, the wildland-urban interface. And so I certainly think that it's something that people should be aware of, and developers should be aware of, right? I mean, it's the same idea as, oh, you're allowing somebody to build a lot of houses right on the other side of this levee, and the levee is 50 years old and it might fail any day, right? Well, okay, who's got responsibility for that? And so, yeah, to the extent that individuals can be aware of that and think about it, yes, absolutely. And I think you'll find also on that website that there are quite a few useful regional reports. There's the Bay Area Regional Report that I think David Ackerley is the lead on. He's a prominent scientist at UC Berkeley, great guy. And I would encourage you to also look at that report, because the attempt in our most recent 4th vulnerability assessment for California was to make the regional reports relevant for people that are trying to do adaptation and mitigation in their regions. And so it's more specific to the region in that way. You considered novel communities arising because of climate change, or do you think the species interactions will remain the same? That's a great question. And I think that we're likely to see both. And taking range maps and doing some kind of a modeling where you model the expected change in range based on the climatic suitability for 5 species that currently grow together. And then you also look at the level of stress, climate stress, that combining those would be a great thing to do. I haven't done it. It would be wonderful to find funding to do something like that. How can we offer our services for seed collection? Oh, thank you for that question. I would say one thing that you could really do, at least the CAL FIRE is limited to being able to collect tree seeds. And they're quite interested in trying to get help in the collection of cones for processing. And if you look up the LA Moran Reforestation Center, then that will get you the CAL FIRE connections for seed collection for conifer seeds. But I would say perhaps amongst the CNPS Yerba Buena chapter, there are opportunities and stands of native plants that and that those are potentially very valuable, and that it's, the state agency and the feds to date are not collecting seeds that I know of for annuals and perennials, shrubs. So that may be an opportunity, and I would not say hold off. I would say go do it this fall, because I think we're going to need it. I'm in the GCM community. What would you and your colleagues want to see from future GCMs to help with your work? Well, some of the hardest things are vapor pressure, nighttime